Welcome to your storytelling. Enjoy the stories, and don't forget to subscribe. I never imagined that one day I'd be sitting in a dimly lit room, being offered a chance to join a drug gang. It wasn't even something I could have ever considered, at least not before everything fell apart. I had a family to care for, and I was always the kind of person who worked hard, played by the rules, and did my best to make sure we were comfortable. But life has a way of changing things, of pushing you into places you never thought you'd go. It all started when we lost our jobs. The economy had taken a downturn, and companies were downsizing left and right. My husband, Tom, and I had both been laid off from our respective jobs. At first, we thought it was just a temporary setback, but as the weeks turned into months, the reality set in. The bills piled up. Our savings dwindled. Our kids, Mia and Jason, started noticing. They weren't stupid. They could see the stress in our faces, the way we'd argue over finances late at night when they were supposed to be asleep. I tried everything. I sent out resumes like a woman possessed, hoping for a callback, any opportunity to bring in some income. But no one was hiring. The few interviews I had ended in polite rejections. The rejections stung, but the silence that followed was even worse. The silence of being unheard, of being invisible. I felt like I was losing myself, and the weight of it all was crushing me. One afternoon, I went to a coffee shop to try and clear my head. I sat in a corner booth, mindlessly stirring my coffee, when a woman I'd never seen before walked in. She was sharp-looking, with dark sunglasses and a businesslike air about her. She sat down across from me without asking, her eyes scanning me for something I couldn't quite identify. "I couldn't help but notice," she said, her voice low and purposeful, "that you look like someone who could use a break." I blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me? I know a way you can make money. Fast. No questions asked." I stared at her, confused, unsure whether I should just get up and leave or hear her out. But something in her eyes, something dangerous, yet intriguing, pulled me in. She was offering a way out, a way to fix everything that had gone wrong in my life. For a split second, I entertained the thought. I needed money, desperately, and here was a woman who might have the answer. "I can't promise it's easy," she said, her voice dropping lower, almost conspiratorially. "But I can promise it will work." That was the moment everything changed. I didn't know it then, but in the hours that followed, I would make a choice that would set me down a path from which there was no turning back. A path I never thought I'd take, but somehow, in that moment, seemed like the only way forward. I left the coffee shop that day with my head spinning. The woman's words echoed in my mind, bouncing around like a persistent noise I couldn't escape. Fast money. No questions. It sounded almost too good to be true, yet in my desperation, it felt like a lifeline. I tried to shake the thought from my head as I walked back to the car, but the thought of my kids, the bills piling up, and Tom's increasing frustration kept pulling me back. That night, I barely slept. I tossed and turned, thinking of the endless piles of unpaid bills and the worry etched in Tom's face. He had tried to keep things together, but I knew he was falling apart on the inside. We were both sinking, and it felt like we were doing everything we could, yet nothing was working. And every day that passed without a job offer made me feel like we were drifting farther apart. I called in every favor I could think of, old colleagues, friends, anyone who might know someone hiring. But nothing panned out. The rejection was wearing me down. I began to feel like a failure, like the world was slowly closing in around me. I wasn't just losing my job. I was losing my dignity, my sense of self-worth. I could feel the walls closing in, the suffocating pressure of everything. Each rejection, each closed door, felt like another layer of weight added to my shoulders. I could see it in Tom's eyes, too. He was trying to hold it together for me, for the kids, but I could tell it was eating him alive. The strain of unemployment had taken its toll on our marriage. We were tense, frustrated, and constantly arguing about what to do next. We both knew the longer we stayed unemployed, the worse it would get. As the weeks turned into months, I began to lose hope. Every new job application felt like a waste of time. I was starting to think that maybe I wasn't cut out for this world anymore. Maybe I had missed my chance. The phone rang one evening as I sat on the couch, scrolling mindlessly through job listings that led nowhere. It was the woman from the coffee shop. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You think about my offer?" she asked, her voice low and measured. I hesitated for a moment, feeling a sickening mix of excitement and fear rise in my chest. Could I really do this? Was this my only option? But before I could respond, she said, "Come to this address tomorrow, 2 p.m. You'll meet someone who can explain everything. You'll be fine." The decision felt out of my hands. It wasn't as if I was truly choosing this life. It was more like I was being pushed toward it, like the universe had run out of options for me. And somehow, deep down, I knew this was it. There was no turning back now. I hung up the phone and looked at Tom, who was sitting on the couch next to me, his face full of exhaustion. I said nothing, but the weight of my silence spoke volumes. He didn't need to know just yet. The next day, I found myself pacing in front of the address the woman had given me. It was an unremarkable building, tucked between two rundown shops. If you didn't know what you were looking for, you'd miss it entirely. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to calm my nerves, but all I could hear was the rushing of my heartbeat. This was a moment of no return. My life would change after this. I had no idea what would come next, but the decision to walk inside felt both inevitable and terrifying. I knocked twice, the sound echoing down the narrow hallway. The door swung open, revealing a man in a black hoodie who didn't say a word but simply stepped aside to let me in. As I crossed the threshold, I felt a strange chill sweep over me, like I was entering a world that didn't belong to me. I glanced around. The walls were bare, the room cold and industrial. But there was a weight to the space, an unspoken understanding that I was about to become a part of something far bigger than myself. The woman from the coffee shop was sitting at a table in the corner, her eyes cool and assessing. She looked different here, more authoritative. She wasn't just a stranger anymore. She was part of this world, and I was about to be, too. She gestured for me to sit. "We don't waste time," she said, her voice clipped. "You want money? You want your life back? Then you need to listen and follow orders." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. I didn't have a choice. I was desperate. She went on, explaining the work. "Simple deliveries," she said. "No questions asked, no involvement beyond dropping off a package." The pay was quick and generous, enough to erase my debts in no time. The more I listened, the more I found myself agreeing. In the back of my mind, something told me it wasn't as simple as it sounded, but I pushed the doubts aside. I had no other options. "Start tomorrow," she said. "We'll give you your first job. It's easy. You'll see. Don't mess it up." I left the building feeling like I had just signed away part of my soul. But the money, the possibility of freedom, was too alluring. I couldn't go back now. I showed up the next day, exactly at the time they told me to. My heart pounded in my chest as I waited by the old van parked on the corner of a dimly lit street. A man appeared, face partially hidden under a baseball cap. Without a word, he handed me a small, inconspicuous bag wrapped in plain brown paper. It wasn't heavy, but it felt like a world of responsibility in my hands. "Just take this to the address on the card. Don't talk to anyone. Get in, get out." "Understood," the man said, his tone firm, almost like a command. I nodded, my palms slick with sweat. It was just a delivery, just a walk through the city to drop off a bag. It seemed simple enough, but as I walked away from the van, something inside me began to twist in fear. My mind raced with thoughts of what might be inside that bag. What if it wasn't just a simple delivery? What if I was stepping into something deeper, something dangerous? I pushed those thoughts aside, focusing on the task. I reached the address, a nondescript apartment building with cracked windows and peeling paint. I walked up the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the silence. At the top, I knocked twice. A man opened the door, looking like he hadn't slept in days. He took the bag without a word, closing the door just as quickly as he had opened it. That was it. I had done it. No one had asked questions, no one had stopped me. I was just another delivery person. But as I walked back down the stairs, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. That first job should have felt like a weight off my shoulders. It was over. I'd done what was asked of me. But instead of feeling relief, I felt something darker growing inside me, an insatiable hunger. The money, the ease. I had just made more in an hour than I had in a whole week of minimum wage work. The bills, the stress, all of it seemed to disappear with the brief exchange. When I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I went straight to the kitchen and opened the envelope the woman had given me. There was a thick stack of cash inside. I didn't count it right away. I didn't need to. I knew it was enough. Enough to pay off overdue rent, credit cards, and even buy a few extra groceries. It was a dream. The kind of dream you don't question because it feels too good to be true. But deep down, something was gnawing at me. I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. This wasn't a regular job. It wasn't a side hustle. It was something darker. And yet, all I could think about was how good it felt to have money again, to not worry about whether we'd have enough to eat. Tom came home that evening, and for the first time in weeks, he smiled. He noticed the weight that had lifted from my shoulders. "You got a job?" he asked, surprised. I hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, freelance work. It's good money." He didn't press further. He was too tired to ask questions, too relieved to have the bills paid. But I could see it in his eyes. The relief was short-lived. I wasn't telling him the full story. I was lying. And I wasn't sure if I was lying to him or to myself. The next day, I received a text from the woman. "Another job. Same place. 2 p.m., don't be late." I hadn't asked for another job. I hadn't planned on it. But the money was calling me, and I knew better than to say no. It was like the first taste of something addictive, and I wanted more. I didn't want to think about the consequences. I didn't want to consider the risks. All I could think about was how much better my life could be if I just kept going. I showed up at the location again, and this time, it felt different. There was a sense of routine. The bag was handed to me without explanation, and the man didn't even bother to tell me where to go. He just handed me a piece of paper with an address scribbled on it. I didn't ask questions. I couldn't afford to. As I walked through the streets, I couldn't help but feel like I was slipping further into a world that didn't belong to me. But the weight of the bag in my hand seemed to ease my fears, reminding me of what I had to gain: freedom, a better life. I just had to keep moving forward, keep delivering, keep taking whatever they gave me. And as the days passed, it became harder and harder to tell myself I was still the person I used to be. It wasn't long before I found myself back in the same room, sitting across from the woman again. This time, though, I wasn't so nervous. I had done it. I had delivered. I had kept my part of the bargain. "We're pleased," she said, her voice colder now, more businesslike. "You're good at following orders. But this is only the beginning. We need people we can trust. People who can handle themselves when the stakes get higher." I stared at her, unsure of what she meant. What could be higher than this? But I didn't ask. She was in control here. "We've got bigger jobs coming your way," she continued, looking at me with calculating eyes. "You'll need to be ready. The more you prove yourself, the more you'll earn. Understand?" I nodded. I didn't know what I was agreeing to, but I knew one thing. I couldn't stop now. Things began to change after that meeting. I started getting more frequent calls, more deliveries. The jobs were becoming more involved, and the woman's cold, calculating demeanor became more intense. There were whispers around me that something bigger was brewing, but no one would tell me exactly what it was. I didn't ask either. At this point, I was just trying to keep my head down and follow orders. The first time I was asked to pick up a package from a different location, I was nervous. It was a warehouse on the outskirts of town, far from the usual routes I'd taken. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, followed. The paranoia set in, but I had learned to suppress it. You didn't ask questions. You didn't show fear. When I arrived, the man who greeted me was different from the usual contacts, more menacing, with a rougher edge. His eyes were hidden behind dark sunglasses, and his demeanor suggested he wasn't someone you wanted to mess with. He didn't smile when he handed me the package. "Get it to the address on the card," he said, his voice low and unwelcoming. "Don't ask questions. Just do your job." As I drove to the next location, I felt a growing sense of dread. What had I gotten myself into? I told myself I could quit anytime. But every time I held that stack of cash, I was reminded of what I was doing this for. The pressure, the responsibility, the need to provide for my family. I dropped off the package as instructed, and for the first time, the man who accepted it didn't thank me. He simply nodded and walked away. The silence hung heavy in the air. I returned to my car and sat there for a moment, heart racing. I had just made another step deeper into this world. There was no going back now, and something told me I wouldn't want to even if I could. I was in it for the money, and it was starting to feel like the only thing that mattered anymore. With every job I did, the pressure mounted. The money was good, but it was becoming clear that I wasn't just working for cash anymore. I was working to prove something, to myself, to the people around me, to whoever was watching. I wasn't just a delivery person anymore. I was part of something bigger, something dangerous, and that realization sent a chill through me every time I closed my front door behind me. Then came the moment I had been dreading. The call that changed everything. The woman's voice was sharp, direct. "We need you to make a pickup. This one is important. Don't screw it up." There was something in her tone that made my skin crawl, but I pushed it aside. I couldn't afford to question anything now. I had to keep moving forward. I went to the location she'd given me, a rundown storage unit on the edge of town. When I arrived, I saw two men standing by a van. One of them motioned for me to approach. The package was bigger this time, heavier. I could feel the weight of it in my hands, and for the first time, a wave of unease washed over me. "You sure this is just a delivery?" I asked, my voice shaky. The man who handed me the package didn't answer. He just stared at me, his cold eyes unreadable. I didn't want to ask any more questions. I took the package and walked away, trying to ignore the feeling that I had just crossed into a world I didn't fully understand. When I got back to the drop-off point, I was met by a different man, one I hadn't seen before. He didn't say anything as he took the package from me. Instead, he handed me an envelope filled with cash and nodded curtly. "You did well," he said, his voice flat. I nodded, grateful for the money, but as I drove home, the words echoed in my mind. You did well. What had I really done? What was I really involved in? I couldn't shake the feeling that I was now a small part of something much bigger and more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. Things started to change at home, too. Tom was still working part-time jobs, trying to keep us afloat, but it wasn't enough. I could see it in his eyes, the fatigue, the worry, the mounting stress. I tried to reassure him, but deep down, I knew I wasn't being honest. I wasn't just working freelance. I wasn't just doing odd jobs. I was part of something much darker now. I couldn't tell him the truth. I couldn't tell him that the money we were using to pay our bills, to keep our lives moving forward, came from a world I wasn't proud of. The guilt gnawed at me, but every time I looked at my kids, every time I saw the relief on Tom's face when I brought home the money, I told myself it was worth it. But then came the day I realized I couldn't keep lying. I was sitting at the kitchen table, going over the bills, when Tom sat down next to me. He was quiet, staring at the stack of bills in front of us. "You're different lately," he said, his voice cautious. "You seem distant. What's going on, really?" My heart sank. He had noticed. He was starting to see through the facade I had carefully built. I didn't know how to answer him. The truth felt too big, too dangerous to admit. But I also knew that the more I kept lying, the further I was pushing him away. He deserved to know, but I couldn't bring myself to tell him. "Not yet. I'm just tired," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's been a rough few months." He didn't push it further, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. It was only a matter of time before he found out the truth. And when he did, I wasn't sure what would happen next. As the weeks went by, the jobs kept coming. More deliveries. More money. I began to feel like I was on autopilot, simply moving from one job to the next without really thinking about what I was doing. The initial fear had worn off, replaced by an almost numbing sense of routine. I didn't think about what was in the packages or who I was working for anymore. I didn't care. I went to the warehouse as instructed, this time meeting a new contact, a woman who was even colder than the last one. She handed me the usual package, but this time, she said something that made my blood run cold. "You're in deeper now," she said, her voice low and threatening. "This is no longer just about the money. You've crossed the line. There's no way out." I nodded, not sure if I should be terrified or relieved. Part of me wanted to walk away, to quit before it was too late. But the other part, the part that had gotten used to the money, the relief, the control, wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. I had crossed the line. And now, there was no turning back. The next few days were a blur. I was juggling more deliveries than I had ever handled before. Each one felt more complicated, more dangerous. The woman who had spoken to me in the warehouse continued to keep a close eye on my progress, never giving me much feedback but always watching. The work was becoming more isolating, and the pressure was mounting. It wasn't just the deliveries that were changing. It was me. I was starting to recognize the desperation in the eyes of my contacts. They weren't just in it for the money. There was something more at play, something bigger, darker, that none of them were willing to talk about. I knew that I had crossed a point where questions weren't welcomed, where answers were scarce, and the only thing that mattered was doing what I was told. One evening, after I dropped off another package at an unfamiliar location, I returned to my car, and there was a man standing there, waiting for me. His face was partially obscured by a hood, but there was something about his stance that made me uneasy. "You're doing good work," he said, his voice smooth but untrustworthy. "But you're getting too close. They're watching you." "Who is?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "The people who want to control everything. You've been a part of something bigger than you realize." I felt a wave of panic surge through me. "What does that mean?" He didn't answer. He just handed me a small envelope and walked away. I stared at it for a long moment, unsure of what to do next. I had become a pawn in someone's game, and the rules were changing. The envelope contained nothing but a cryptic note. "You know too much." It was enough to send my mind racing. What had I gotten myself into? I was no longer just delivering packages. I was involved in something I didn't fully understand, something I couldn't control. The web that I had willingly stepped into was tightening around me, and I didn't know how to break free. I kept telling myself that I could quit at any time, that I could walk away, but every time I said it, I felt the lie on the tip of my tongue. I wasn't ready to quit. The money was too much. My family depended on it. I couldn't go back to the way things were. Not now. The woman's face kept appearing in my mind, her cold, calculating gaze. She never showed emotion, and that made her even more dangerous. She was pulling the strings, and I was just a small part of her plan, a pawn in her game. The truth was, I was terrified, but I couldn't let anyone know. I couldn't let them see the fear in my eyes, or else I would lose everything I had worked for. It was only a matter of time before everything started to crack. The pressure was getting to me. The constant fear, the lies, the uncertainty. Each job was more demanding than the last, and it was becoming harder to keep track of who I was working for and why. I had no answers, just a growing sense of dread. Tom started asking more questions, his suspicions rising. I could see the doubt in his eyes, the way he scrutinized me when I came home late or when I lied about where I had been. I hated myself for keeping this from him, for letting him think everything was okay when it was far from it. One night, I came home to find him sitting at the kitchen table, holding a stack of bills in his hands. There was a look of resignation on his face, as if he had finally figured it all out. "You've been lying to me," he said quietly, his voice heavy with pain. "What's really going on?" I couldn't lie anymore. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. The truth spilled out of me in a rush, a torrent of fear and regret. "I'm in over my head," I admitted, my voice breaking. "I've been working for a group, a gang. They've been giving me jobs, deliveries, and I've been doing it for the money. I didn't know what else to do. We were struggling, Tom. I was desperate." His eyes softened, but the hurt was still there. "Why didn't you come to me? We could have figured something out." "I was scared," I whispered. "I didn't want to lose you. Lose everything." There was silence between us, a heavy, suffocating silence. I had just laid bare my deepest secret, and now the truth was out. But it didn't feel like relief. It felt like I had just unleashed a storm that I couldn't control. The next few days were the hardest of my life. Tom didn't speak to me much. He couldn't look at me without seeing the woman I had become, the woman I didn't want to be. I understood his silence. I didn't know how to make him understand why I had done it. There was no easy explanation. Then the phone call came. It was the woman. Her voice was cold, like it always was, but there was an edge to it that made my blood run cold. "You've been careless," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "You've told someone about us." My heart dropped into my stomach. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice shaking. "You know exactly what I'm talking about. Your husband. He knows too much now." I froze. "No, please. He won't say anything." "He won't. Doesn't matter. He knows too much. And now, you have a choice. Keep working for us, keep your family safe, or walk away and watch everything you've built crumble." The ultimatum was clear. There was no room for negotiation. "I'll keep working," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I'll do whatever it takes." There was a pause, then a single, cold laugh. "Good. You know what happens if you disappoint us." The line went dead. I didn't know what would happen next. All I knew was that I was trapped. There was no way out. I had made my choice. In the days that followed the phone call, I tried to focus on the work. More deliveries, more jobs. But the fear never fully left me. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart skipped a beat. I kept wondering if this would be the moment they would come for me, the moment everything would come crashing down. But life went on. Tom and I barely spoke. He was still upset, and I couldn't blame him. How could I explain myself when I didn't even understand why I had gone so far? One evening, as I was getting ready to leave for another drop-off, I noticed something unusual. Tom had left his laptop open on the kitchen table. Normally, he'd never leave it like that, but tonight he did. Against my better judgment, curiosity got the best of me. I walked over, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. There, on the screen, was an email he had drafted, but never sent. The subject line read, "I know what you've been doing." My stomach sank as I skimmed the words. He knew. He knew everything. In the email, Tom had written about how he had started tracking the delivery routes, the money I was bringing in, and how he had pieced everything together. He was planning to confront me. He wanted to know how far this had gone and how dangerous it had become. I felt a rush of panic. I couldn't let him do that. I couldn't let him bring the truth to light. But I also couldn't bring myself to delete the email. Before I could decide what to do, I heard Tom's footsteps in the hallway. He had seen me reading the email. "Why didn't you tell me, Sarah?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Why didn't you trust me enough to let me help?" I turned to face him, feeling a wave of guilt and shame wash over me. There was nothing left to say. The truth was out, and nothing would ever be the same again. The days that followed were full of tension. I avoided Tom as much as possible, too scared to look him in the eye. I couldn't bring myself to apologize. What could I possibly say? The words felt hollow, and I wasn't sure I even believed them anymore. But something unexpected happened. The woman who had been orchestrating everything called me again. "You need to meet someone," she said flatly. "Tomorrow, 3 p.m. Same place as before. Don't be late." I had no choice but to follow the instructions. The weight of the decision was suffocating, but I had made a promise to myself, to my family, that I would protect them no matter what. That meant continuing this dangerous game, no matter the cost. When I arrived at the meeting spot, I was greeted by a man I had never seen before. He looked like a typical corporate businessman, clean-cut, well-dressed, but there was something unsettling in his eyes. "Are you Sarah?" he asked, his voice smooth but firm. "Yes," I said cautiously, wondering what this meeting would bring. He didn't waste any time. "I have an offer for you. You can walk away from this life, but there's a catch. If you leave, we'll make sure your husband doesn't survive the fallout. His safety depends on you continuing the work." I felt my blood run cold. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about Tom, too. If I left, I risked his life. If I stayed, I was digging deeper into a pit I might never escape. "What kind of offer is that?" I asked, my voice shaking. "The kind where you have no choice," the man replied coldly. I didn't have to think for long. The reality of the situation hit me like a slap in the face. I had never signed up for this. I had never imagined I would be pushed into a position where I had to choose between my own survival and the safety of the people I loved most. But here I was, stuck in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I walked away from the meeting that afternoon, my mind in a frenzy. I tried to convince myself that there was still a way out, but deep down, I knew better. The offer wasn't just a choice. It was an ultimatum. At home, Tom was waiting for me, his eyes filled with suspicion. "What happened?" he asked, watching me carefully. I couldn't tell him the truth, not yet. He had already been through so much, and I wasn't ready to pull him into this nightmare. So I lied. I told him the meeting had been about a potential new job, a way for me to start over. He didn't believe me, of course, but he didn't push it. He just sighed and rubbed his face, exhausted. "I don't know what's going on with you anymore, Sarah," he said softly. "I just want us to be okay again." I couldn't promise him that. Not when the danger was growing closer every day. Later that night, the phone rang again. It was the woman. "Remember your choice," she said, her voice as cold as ever. "Your loyalty is everything to us. If you betray us, it'll be your last mistake." I hung up without saying a word, staring at the phone in my hand. There was no going back now. Whatever decision I made, it would change everything. The pressure was suffocating. Every day, I felt the walls closing in on me. I couldn't make a move without feeling like I was being watched. The sense of paranoia crept into every corner of my life. Tom noticed it, too. He could see the change in me, but I was too scared to explain. One night, as I walked to my car after a delivery, I noticed a black car parked across the street, its headlights off. My heart raced. Was it them? Had they finally come for me? I walked quickly, my eyes glued to the car, but it didn't move. I told myself I was being paranoid. I had to be. After all, no one had threatened me directly. Not yet. But the next day, when I checked my email, I found a single line from the woman. "We are always watching. Don't make the mistake of thinking you're alone." It was like a chill ran through my veins. They were everywhere. There was no escaping them. And the longer I stayed in this world, the more I realized how true that statement was. I couldn't afford to slip up. The slightest mistake could cost me everything. And soon, I would have to make a choice, my family or my life in this underworld. The days blurred together as I went through the motions. Deliveries, pickups, more money. It had all become a routine. But each time I received a new assignment, the weight of the decision grew heavier. The offers from the woman's team were becoming more tempting, more dangerous. And each time, I thought about Tom, the life I was dragging him into. Then, everything changed. The phone rang, and it was the man from the meeting. "We need you for one last job," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Get the job done, and we'll let you walk. No more threats. No more games. You and your family can leave this life behind." I knew this was it. This was the deal. I had no choice but to take it. One last job. But in the back of my mind, I knew the truth. There was no such thing as a last job, and I had just made the deal with the devil. I couldn't stop thinking about the man's words. One last job. There was a weight to it, something that made my stomach turn. It was too clean, too final. People who said things like that always had a hidden agenda, and I was starting to realize just how deep I was in. The job was simple on paper. Meet someone at a specific location, deliver a small, unmarked package, and leave. But there was something about the way the man had spoken that made my nerves flare. What was really in that package? Who was I really working for? I told myself I could do it, that I had to do it. This was my way out, the opportunity to end everything and start over. No more lies. No more fear. Just freedom. I left the house early that morning, telling Tom I had another job interview. The truth was too dangerous. I couldn't risk him knowing what I was really doing. Not yet. Not until it was over. The location was in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. As I drove there, the weight in my chest grew heavier with each mile. I could feel the eyes on me, even though no one was watching. The shadows of my past decisions were closing in, and I had nowhere to run. When I arrived, a man was already waiting for me. He looked like the kind of person I had seen 1,000 times before in this world. Cold, detached, and calculating. "You're late," he said, his tone clipped. "Get the package and make the exchange." I didn't say a word. I just nodded, grabbing the small parcel from the back seat and walking toward him. This was it. The moment I had been waiting for. Or at least, I thought it was. As soon as I handed over the package, everything changed. The man looked at it briefly, then back at me, his expression unreadable. He took a step closer, and for a moment, I thought he was going to congratulate me, or maybe give me the final payment. But instead, he whispered, "You're in deeper than you think." Before I could respond, the warehouse doors slammed shut. My heart raced. I turned to see two men standing behind me, blocking my only exit. "What's going on?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. "This isn't what I agreed to." The first man just smirked. "Oh, you didn't think it would be that easy, did you? One last job?" That was just the beginning. I felt the blood drain from my face. I had walked into a trap, and now there was no way out. They led me into the heart of the warehouse, where a group of people was gathered around a table. The leader, a woman who was more formidable than anyone I had met before, sat at the head of the table, watching me with cold, calculating eyes. "You've proven yourself useful," she said, her voice smooth but with an undertone of menace. "But there's more work to be done. You're not walking away so easily." I opened my mouth to protest, but the words died on my tongue. I realized then that I had been played all along. This was never about me getting out. It was about making sure I couldn't leave. The woman, whose name I would later learn was Veronica, wasn't interested in excuses. She didn't care about my life outside of this. She only cared about power, control, and making sure that her network kept running smoothly. And she had plans for me, plans I wasn't prepared for. "You've been a good little worker," she said, standing up and circling me like a predator. "But now, it's time to take on more responsibility. You're going to be an integral part of our operations. You'll handle things that require a delicate touch." I felt my stomach churn. "What are you talking about?" I managed to croak. She smiled, but it wasn't kind. "You'll find out soon enough. You're not going back to your little life, Sarah. This is who you are now." I wanted to scream, to run, but I knew it wouldn't do any good. The walls had closed in. There was no escape from this world I had been dragged into. And worst of all, I realized that I was complicit in it now. I was part of it. I couldn't walk away. Not after everything I had done. Veronica's team kept me there for what felt like hours, explaining the next steps, how I would be involved in their operations, what role I would play. The entire time, I just nodded, my mind spinning with the enormity of what was happening. My life had become a nightmare, and the scariest part was that I couldn't remember when it had stopped being my choice. The days after my meeting with Veronica blurred into each other. I did my work without thinking, feeling the weight of each task as it piled on top of me. I didn't see Tom much. He was busy with his own life, but I knew he was suspicious. He had to be. Then, one night, I came home to find him sitting in the kitchen, holding my phone. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at me, his face a mixture of anger and hurt. "I found your phone hidden in the drawer," he said quietly. "I went through it, Sarah. I saw the texts, the messages. I know what you've been doing." I felt my heart stop in my chest. I thought I had covered my tracks. I thought I had been careful, but now everything was falling apart. I started, but he cut me off. "You think I don't see it?" he said, his voice rising now. "You're not the woman I married anymore. I don't know who you are." I didn't know how to respond. What could I say? The truth was too dangerous, and the lies had become too deep. I had lost his trust. And in that moment, I realized something else. I had lost myself, too. Things between Tom and me deteriorated quickly after that night. He stopped speaking to me, his silence suffocating, and I knew he was preparing to leave. I couldn't blame him. How could I expect him to stay when I had become someone else? Meanwhile, Veronica's people were breathing down my neck, reminding me constantly of my place in their world. I was expendable, just another cog in the machine, and they were making sure I understood that. The pressure from both sides, my crumbling marriage and the gang, was pushing me to the edge. I didn't know how much longer I could keep it together. I couldn't lose Tom, but I couldn't keep living this double life. I had to make a choice, but I was terrified that no matter what I chose, I would lose everything. One evening, as I sat alone in the dark, the phone rang. It was the one call I had been waiting for, the one that would change everything. It was from the man who had first pulled me into this mess. "We have a situation," he said flatly. "Get ready. We need you tonight." I knew that the job was just a distraction, a test, but I couldn't bring myself to do it anymore. I was at the breaking point. The phone call echoed in my head long after I hung up. I felt the weight of the words pressing down on me. "We need you tonight." What was I supposed to do now? I had made so many compromises, so many sacrifices. But the thought of continuing down this path, sinking deeper into this world, felt like a death sentence. Tom was still distant, and I knew he was planning to leave. I couldn't blame him. I had already betrayed him in ways he would never forgive. But if I didn't make a decision soon, I would lose him forever. And I would lose myself in the process. I needed to make a clean break. I needed to walk away. But the gang wouldn't let me go that easily. And deep down, I knew I was too far gone. I was in their grip now, and they weren't going to let me escape. I sat in the dark, my mind racing. How did I get here? How had I let everything spiral so far out of control? I had tried to do the right thing, but every choice I made just seemed to drag me further into a nightmare. Finally, I picked up the phone again. I had made my decision. The job, the calls, the people, none of it mattered anymore. I wasn't going to do it. I wasn't going to let them pull me deeper into their web. But when I dialed the number, I couldn't bring myself to speak. The words stuck in my throat. I had made my choice, but I wasn't sure it was the right one. The next morning, I was planning my escape. The thought of leaving everything behind filled me with a mix of relief and dread. It was the only way forward, but it felt like I was running from something that would catch up with me eventually. I couldn't tell Tom. Not yet. He wouldn't understand. He'd think I was just making more excuses. And maybe in a way, I was. But there was no time to explain. I packed a bag with essentials, clothes, some cash, my ID, and slipped out of the house before he woke up. The plan was simple. Get to the bus station, leave town, and disappear. But as I stood in front of the bus station, staring at the options in front of me, I felt the weight of my decision pressing down harder than ever. I wasn't just leaving a life behind. I was leaving my past, my future, and everyone I loved. I wasn't sure who I was anymore. I took a deep breath and bought a ticket. No turning back now. As the bus pulled away from the station, I felt the familiar ache of guilt. I had made my choice, but that didn't mean it was the right one. Leaving felt like betrayal, not just to Tom, but to everything I had fought for. But before I could even settle into my seat, the phone buzzed. It was a text from Tom. "Where are you?" My heart pounded. I couldn't respond. I had made a break for it, but I couldn't leave him completely behind. The thought of his hurt, his anger, was too much to bear. But I had to keep moving. The text kept coming. "Talk to me, Sarah. Don't do this." I stared at the screen, the words blurring together. I felt sick, like I was drowning in my own lies. But I couldn't go back. I couldn't let myself be dragged back into that life. Then another text came through. "I know where you are. I'm coming to find you." My breath caught in my throat. How did he know? Had he found my things? Did he know about the gang? I couldn't take the chance. I had to keep going. By the time I got off the bus in the next town, I was a nervous wreck. My phone buzzed nonstop, but I couldn't bring myself to answer. I couldn't let Tom find me, not now. Not when everything was so fragile. I tried to blend in, walking quickly through the unfamiliar streets, keeping my head down. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. It wasn't just the feeling of paranoia. I was being hunted. I ducked into a coffee shop, ordered a drink, and sat at the back. My phone rang again, and I glanced at the screen. Tom. I was about to ignore the call when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A figure, standing outside, staring directly at the window. I froze. I couldn't tell if it was him, but I didn't want to take any chances. I stood up and rushed out the back door, hoping I hadn't been seen. The streets were empty, but I could still feel eyes on me. My heart raced as I turned a corner, ducking into a narrow alley. I needed to get away, fast. I kept running, my mind in overdrive. Tom wasn't far behind. I could feel it, but I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to confront him. I was too afraid of what I might find. When I finally stopped, I was out of breath and trembling. I had run as far as I could, but there was no safe place for me anymore. I had cut myself off from everything I knew, and now I had nowhere to turn. I stood there, alone in the alley, looking down at my phone. Tom's last message was still unread. "I'm not giving up on you, Sarah." And for the first time in what felt like forever, I started to cry. The tears didn't stop. For the first time, I felt everything crashing down around me. The choices I'd made, the lies I'd told, the people I'd betrayed. I had pushed everyone away, but now I couldn't outrun the consequences. I wiped my face, trying to pull myself together. I had to be strong, but deep down, I knew I couldn't keep running forever. If Tom was still looking for me, I had to face him eventually. I didn't have much time to gather my thoughts before I saw him. He was standing at the end of the alley, just a few steps away, his eyes locked onto mine. The tension between us was palpable. "I told you I wouldn't give up," he said quietly. His voice was strained, but there was a resolve in it that I couldn't ignore. I couldn't speak. What could I say? I had no excuses left. I had put us in this position, and now I was staring at the wreckage of everything I had once cared about. He stepped closer, his eyes searching mine. "Sarah, what are you doing? Why are you running from me?" I wanted to tell him everything, how I was in too deep, how there was no way out. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just stared at him, my heart aching. "I'm sorry," I whispered, the guilt swallowing me whole. Tom didn't say anything at first. He just looked at me, as if weighing his options. I could see the hurt in his eyes, the betrayal, and I couldn't blame him. I had done this to us. "Listen to me, Sarah," he said after a long silence. "You don't have to do this anymore. Whatever they're making you do, you can stop. I'll help you. We can start over. We can leave all of this behind." His words pierced through me like a knife. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to go back to the life we had before all of this started. But I knew better. I knew it wasn't that simple. "I can't, Tom," I said, shaking my head. "It's not that easy. I'm not the person you think I am. I've made too many mistakes. I've gone too far." His face hardened. "That's not true. You're still the woman I married. You can still fix this, Sarah, but you have to choose. You can either keep running, or you can come home with me. It's up to you." I stood there, torn. I didn't know what to do. My mind was a whirlwind of fear, regret, and longing. But I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't keep living this double life. I didn't know how long we stood there in the alley, the city noise blurring into the background. My heart was pounding, my thoughts racing. But all I could focus on was Tom's face, his expression, his voice, the way he reached out to me as if he could save me. "Come home, Sarah," he said again, his tone softer now. "I don't care what you've done. I'll help you. We'll figure it out together." And for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe there was a way out. Maybe, just maybe, I could start over. I nodded, my throat tight. "Okay, I'll come home." Tom smiled, relief washing over him. He took my hand, and together, we walked back to the bus station. The world didn't feel as heavy now. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I had a chance. We didn't talk much on the way back. We just walked side by side, and for a moment, I allowed myself to believe that things could go back to the way they were. Maybe I could leave the past behind. Maybe I could escape the gang, the lies, the guilt. But as we boarded the bus, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My skin prickled with unease. It was as if the weight of everything I had done was pressing down on me, and no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape it. Tom was by my side, but in my heart, I knew that my past would follow me. It wasn't over yet. There would be a price to pay for my freedom. I leaned my head against the window, staring out at the passing scenery, lost in thought. I didn't know what would happen when we reached our destination. I didn't know if we would make it out of this unscathed. But I had made my choice. I had decided to fight for a life I could be proud of, even if it meant facing the consequences of my actions. As the bus rolled on, I thought about everything I had lost and everything I still stood to lose. Tom and I were on our way to a new life, but I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that things weren't over yet. The gang, Veronica, they would come for me. I was sure of it. I could run, but I couldn't hide from my past forever. The thought made my stomach twist. But then I remembered Tom's words. "We'll figure it out together." For the first time in a long time, I realized that I didn't have to do this alone. I didn't have to carry the burden of my choices by myself. Maybe I couldn't erase the past, but I could face it head on. And I would, with Tom by my side. When the bus pulled into the station, I looked at him, determination in my eyes. "We're not running anymore, Tom," I said quietly. "We're going to fight." His eyes softened, and he squeezed my hand. "I'm with you, Sarah. We'll take it one step at a time." And for the first time in ages, I felt like I could breathe again. It felt surreal, stepping off the bus into a new town, with only Tom and my thoughts for company. The air felt different here, less oppressive, but the weight of the decisions I had made still pressed heavily on my chest. I couldn't outrun them, but at least, with Tom by my side, I wasn't alone in this. We found a small, run-down apartment to rent. It wasn't much, but it was ours. The silence between us spoke volumes, yet there was comfort in knowing we had taken the first step toward rebuilding. But the shadow of the gang loomed large. I knew they'd be looking for me. I spent the next few days staying inside, afraid to venture out. The apartment became a sanctuary, a place where I could pretend for a moment that everything was normal. But I knew it wasn't. I couldn't hide forever. Tom kept reassuring me that everything would be okay, but I saw the worry in his eyes. I had to face the truth. I had dragged him into a mess, and he didn't deserve this. But I couldn't tell him that. Not yet. The phone buzzed one night, an unknown number flashing on the screen. I froze. It was them. I could feel it in my bones. The past was coming for me, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep running. I stared at the phone, my hand trembling. Tom was asleep on the couch, but I couldn't risk waking him. I needed to hear who it was, but at the same time, I feared what it would mean. I took a deep breath and answered. "Sarah," a voice said, low and calm. "You can't hide forever." I recognized the voice. It was Veronica. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. "Leave me alone," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm done. I'm out." There was a pause, followed by a soft laugh that made my blood run cold. "You think you can just walk away? You owe us, Sarah, and you'll pay your debt. You know where to find us when you're ready." And then she hung up. I dropped the phone onto the table, my mind spinning. I couldn't go back, but I couldn't outrun her either. The moment I got involved with them, there was no going back. And I had just learned that the past had no intention of letting me go. I turned to Tom, sitting on the couch, waiting for him to wake up. I had to tell him everything. He couldn't stay in the dark anymore. The sun had barely risen, and I found myself sitting across from Tom, my hands clenched tightly in my lap. I had no idea how to start this conversation, how to explain to him everything I had done. The lies, the choices, the people I had gotten involved with. "Tom," I said, my voice shaking. "There's something I need to tell you." He looked at me with concern in his eyes, his hand reaching out to mine. "What is it, Sarah? You know you can tell me anything." I swallowed hard. The words lodged in my throat. I had hidden the truth from him for so long, and now I had no choice but to lay it all out. The reason I left, why I kept running, it's not just because of the money problems. It's because I got involved with people I shouldn't have. The gang. They've been threatening me, and I've been doing things for them that I'm not proud of. His expression changed, and for a moment, I feared he would walk away. But he didn't. He stayed, listening. "I didn't want to tell you. I didn't want to drag you into this. But I need you to know everything." Tom didn't say anything for a long time. He just stared at me, his face unreadable. I braced myself for his anger, for his betrayal. "Sarah," he said finally, his voice soft. "I don't know what to say, but I'm not leaving you. Not now." Tears welled up in my eyes, and I felt a rush of relief mixed with guilt. He deserved so much better than this. But here we were, together, trying to make sense of a mess I had created. Tom and I spent the next few days coming up with a plan. I had to cut ties with the gang once and for all, but it wasn't going to be easy. Veronica and her people wouldn't let me walk away without consequences. "We need to go to the police," Tom suggested one evening, after we had discussed everything in detail. "They can help you, Sarah. They can protect us." I shook my head. "I can't. I've already crossed too many lines. If I go to the police, they'll just come after us even harder. They have connections everywhere." Tom didn't like it, but he didn't push me. He understood, even if it scared him. I wasn't sure what my next step was, but I knew I had to end this on my terms. and that meant taking the fight to them. I had to be smart. I had to outmaneuver them. They thought I was weak, but they had no idea how far I was willing to go. We spent the next few days getting ready. I started reaching out to people from my past, trying to figure out who could help me. It felt like stepping into enemy territory, but I couldn't keep running. I had to fight for my freedom, for my future, for Tom. The night before we were supposed to meet with a former contact, I found myself staring at the phone, unsure if I was making the right decision. Was I willing to go down this path? Was I really ready to fight back? Tom had already gone to bed, and I was left alone with my thoughts. I hadn't told him everything yet. I hadn't told him about the person I was meeting tomorrow. I couldn't bring myself to tell him. But as the clock ticked, I realized there was no turning back. The consequences of my choices were coming, whether I was ready or not. And I had to be strong for both of us. The question was, could I keep my promise to Tom and still survive in this world I had created? The air outside was cold, but my nerves were colder. Tom had no idea what I was about to do. He thought I was meeting someone who could help us leave all of this behind. But the truth was, I wasn't so sure I was ready to leave. Not yet. I needed more information, and I needed to do this on my own. I walked into the small, dimly lit cafe, my heart pounding in my chest. My contact, a man named Jake, was already sitting at a table in the corner. He looked up as I approached, his eyes scanning me like he was sizing me up. I couldn't blame him. I was still unsure whether this was a good idea. "Jake," I said, sitting down across from him, "I need your help. I need to get out for good." He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he leaned back, his expression unreadable. "You sure about this? Once you're in, there's no getting out easy." I nodded. "I don't have a choice. They won't leave me alone." Jake studied me, his eyes narrowing. "All right, I'll help, but you'll need to make a deal with me. No more secrets, no more games. You tell me everything and we'll get this done." It was a fair deal, but I knew there was a price. The more I told him, the more dangerous it would get. But I was willing to take that risk if it meant ending this nightmare. Jake's terms were simple. He would help me, but I had to give him full access to everything I knew about the gang. All their operations, all their people, everything. And I had to do it willingly, without hesitation. I agreed, though I felt a knot tightening in my stomach. I had already betrayed so many people, and now I was about to betray the only family I had left, the gang itself. As I started talking, it felt like the walls were closing in. I spoke about their inner workings, their connections, the things I had seen and done. Every word felt like a weight being lifted, but with each passing sentence, I realized just how deep I was in. Jake took notes, nodding along, but he didn't seem fazed. I couldn't tell if he was just used to this kind of thing, or if he was playing me for something bigger. But right now, I didn't have the luxury of questioning him. When I finished, he set down his pen and leaned forward. "All right, Sarah, I can get you out of this, but it won't be easy. There are people watching you. They'll make sure you pay for this." I nodded. "I know, but I'm willing to take the risk." He looked at me for a moment, like he was trying to gauge if I was bluffing. Finally, he spoke. "All right, I'll set things in motion. You'll hear from me soon." As I left the cafe, I felt a strange mix of hope and dread. I was one step closer to freedom, but I had no idea what price I would have to pay. The next few days were tense. Tom could tell something was bothering me, but I didn't tell him about the deal with Jake. He had enough to worry about, and I didn't want to drag him into this any further. I stayed inside, mostly. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. My nerves were shot, and I kept jumping at every sound, every movement. I was on edge, constantly checking over my shoulder. Tom tried to keep things normal, but I could see the worry in his eyes. He knew something was off, but I couldn't tell him. Not yet. The phone rang one evening, and my heart skipped a beat. It was Jake. I picked up quickly. "What's going on?" "Things are moving faster than I thought," he said. "They're onto you, Sarah. You need to be ready to leave. Now." My blood ran cold. I didn't have much time. I had to make a choice, stay and face whatever was coming, or run and hope I could outrun my past. I hung up the phone, my mind racing. This was it. The moment I had been dreading was here. I looked at Tom, who was sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone. I had to make a decision. I had to tell him everything, or I would be running alone. But I couldn't drag him into this mess. I couldn't bear the thought of him getting hurt because of me. I walked over to him, my hands shaking. "Tom, I have to go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's not safe anymore." He looked up at me, confused. "What do you mean? What's going on?" I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "The gang, they know. They've been watching me. I'm not safe here." His face fell. "What? Sarah, you can't just leave. We can figure this out together." I shook my head. "No, Tom, you don't understand. I've already dragged you into this too far. I have to handle this on my own." He stood up, his expression hardening. "You're not going anywhere alone. I'm with you, Sarah. Always." Tears welled up in my eyes as I looked at him. "You don't have to do this. I can't keep putting you in danger." But Tom was determined. "I made a promise to you, remember? I'm not breaking it now." I felt a wave of relief and fear at the same time. He was choosing to stand by me, even though he didn't fully understand the danger. And I didn't know if I was strong enough to protect him. The next morning, everything was set in motion. We packed our things quickly, not saying much, just focusing on the task at hand. Tom was more determined than ever, and for the first time, I felt a flicker of hope that maybe we could get out of this. Jake's instructions were clear. We had to leave the city. Fast. I wasn't sure what Jake had planned, but I was running out of options. If I stayed, they'd come for me, and for Tom. We grabbed what we could carry and left the apartment without a second glance. I couldn't look back. I had to keep moving forward, for both of us. As we made our way out of the city, I could feel the weight of my past getting heavier. I didn't know what would happen when we reached the next town, or if we'd be safe at all, but I knew I had to keep running. I couldn't let them catch us. We drove for hours, not speaking much, just the hum of the road and the occasional glance between us. Tom kept checking the rearview mirror, and I couldn't blame him. It felt like we were being followed, though I couldn't see anyone. I kept telling myself it was just paranoia, but the fear gnawed at me. Finally, we arrived at a small house in the middle of nowhere, a place Jake had recommended for us to lay low for a while. The isolation was both a relief and a curse. No one could find us here, but neither could we truly relax. We unloaded the car and set up inside. The house was small, but it was all we needed. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt a small sense of peace. But the silence was deafening. We were waiting for something, anything, to happen. Tom went to bed early that night, but I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the phone call with Jake and what he had said. They were coming. The gang wouldn't let us slip away unnoticed. I had to be ready for what was next, whatever it would be. The next morning, I was up before dawn, making coffee when there was a knock at the door. My heart stopped. It was too soon. I hadn't expected anyone. I peeked through the window, but the only thing I saw was a shadow moving by the door. My breath caught in my throat. Was it them? Had they already found us? I motioned to Tom, who was still half asleep on the couch. His eyes widened in alarm, and I knew we both had the same thought. We weren't safe yet. We waited, holding our breath, as the knock came again, louder this time. I reached for the gun Jake had given me, the weight of it unfamiliar in my hand. I was no stranger to danger, but I wasn't sure I was ready for this kind of confrontation. I opened the door cautiously, my hand still gripping the handle, and there, standing in front of me, was Jake. "I didn't think you'd be alone," he said, his voice low. His eyes darted around the house, scanning every corner like he was checking for a threat. "Jake," I said, relieved but also suspicious. "What's going on? Why are you here?" Jake stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his face serious. "We need to talk. It's not safe here anymore. They know you're in town." I felt my stomach drop. "How?" "We've been careful." Jake shook his head. "You underestimated them. They've been tracking you. I thought we had more time, but I was wrong." Tom stood up behind me, his fists clenched. "What does that mean? What do we do now?" "We leave." "Now," Jake said, his tone firm. "They're closer than you think." Jake didn't waste any time. We packed our things quickly, moving in a blur of frantic energy. Tom was asking questions, but Jake wasn't offering much. He just kept pushing us to move faster. I felt a sense of urgency building inside me, a realization that there was no going back. Everything I had done, everything I had dragged Tom into, had led us to this moment. We had no other choice but to keep moving forward. Jake had arranged for us to meet someone who could help us cross the border and disappear. He didn't tell us much about the person, only that they could be trusted. I wasn't sure if I believed him, but I didn't have time to question it. As we made our way out of the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. "Stay close," Jake instructed, his voice sharp. "We don't have time for distractions." We followed him through a series of back alleys and hidden paths, trying to stay out of sight. The further we went, the more I felt the weight of our decisions bearing down on me. Every step was a step into the unknown, and I had no idea where it would lead. But I had no choice. I had to trust Jake, even if I didn't fully trust him. After what felt like hours, we finally reached a secluded part of the town. There was a van waiting for us, and a man standing beside it, his face hidden in the shadows. Jake approached the man, exchanging a few brief words in a language I didn't understand. I could feel the tension in the air, the silent exchange of information. The man nodded, and Jake turned to us. "This is it," Jake said. "You're safe now. Just follow his lead, and everything will be fine." I wasn't convinced. There was too much uncertainty in the air, too many unanswered questions. But I didn't have a choice. We had come this far, and there was no turning back now. The man led us into the van, and we drove for what felt like an eternity. The further we went, the more isolated we became. There were no lights, no signs of civilization, just darkness and the sound of the tires on the road. It was a strange feeling, like we were disappearing off the map, erasing ourselves from the lives we had once known. It was both liberating and terrifying. We didn't speak during the ride. There was nothing left to say. We had made our choice, and now we had to live with it. By the time we arrived at our destination, the sun was beginning to rise. We were in a small, remote village, far from the city we had left behind. Jake and the man exchanged a few more words, and then we were left standing in front of a small house. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. "This is it," Jake said, looking at us one last time. "You'll be safe here for a while. Lay low, don't attract attention, and you'll be fine." I nodded, my mind racing with the possibilities. We had escaped, but I knew the gang wouldn't stop looking for us. We had to be careful. We had to survive. As Jake drove off, leaving us alone in this new place, I turned to Tom. "We did it," I said, my voice filled with disbelief. "We made it out." Tom didn't say anything for a moment. Then he looked at me, his eyes soft. "We're not out of the woods yet, but we're together. And that's all that matters." I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like we had a chance to build a life without fear, without the shadows of the past haunting us. It wasn't much, but it was enough.